Welcome to Bots in the Building. My name is Michele Davis and I'm your host. So, this podcast is going to focus on where AI integration meets team adoption. So, if you're seeing me for the first time, prior to my 10 years or so in digital marketing and building automations, and in the last several years, my business has focused on AI integration. And prior to that, I had a whole nother career. I spent a couple of decades working with governmental and nonprofit entities, and 16 years was spent as a manager. And over the course of those 16 years, I implemented so many changes in how we handle clients, changes in our processes, changes in just our mindset and our mind frame around doing new things to better serve the clients that we worked with. And I also had my share of technology changes as well, where, I had to lead my team through adopting a new software. So when we think about change management, I've had my share in implementing change with organizations, and it's not enough to decide to make a change if the very team that's supposed to use and implement whatever it is that you come up with, if they don't integrate it in their daily workday, it means nothing. So this podcast is dedicated to not just helping people install tools and systems, because that's the easy part. This podcast is dedicated to getting people to adopt the change. So with that said, let's get into the episode. Let me guess. You want to integrate AI into your company or business and you don't know where to start, or you hired someone and now we're 3 months later, 6 months later, and you're not seeing the results that you want. If that's the case, you definitely want to listen to this episode. So, in the last episode, I talked about just a lot of the shifts that are happening based on what I'm seeing, and a lot of it around technology and how people are changing, how they hire, how they operate. And like I mentioned in the last episode, there's going to be some companies that see the writing on the wall. They're already rolling out plans to integrate AI, and they're already rolling out plans to support their teams. But there's going to be some companies that are going to be left behind because the technology changes that are happening now, and they're happening fast. And unless you have a plan to start doing what's necessary to stay competitive, you run the risk of not being able to be around in the next 5 years or 10 years. And I'm not saying that to scare anyone. I'm just saying that because while you're complaining about technology, or while some businesses or companies are complaining about technology, other companies are adopting it at rapid pace. So you have to keep up to stay competitive. Because if you don't adopt the technology, your competitors will. And they're going to be the ones that get the business, because even if you don't want to adopt the technology as a business owner, your clients and your customers are going to have an expectation based on what your competitor is doing, that you should do the same thing, or you should have the same amenities available, or you should have the same availability or same technology advancements. Otherwise, they're going to seek out services from your competitor instead if you don't adopt the changes. So, in this episode, I want to get more specific about the step that a lot of companies skip when it comes down to AI integration or any, change management. And that is revealing what the problem is. And that requires assessment process. And so I want to get into what should be included in that assessment, what I do with my clients, because what you reveal in the assessment process is really the framework for guiding whatever integration and change you want to happen in your company. So, in this episode, we're talking about what to do before you hire anyone or buy anything. So, here's the scenario: a company sees AI, they see what they think AI is, online on social media. Maybe they've done a little bit of research. Maybe they've played around with AI a little bit on their own, and they want to integrate it into their company. And they look at the tool, or they look at the software, or they look at a process, and they're like, "Oh, that would be great to integrate into my company." But here's the problem with that way of thinking. You're thinking about the tool or the software before you identify the actual problem that you're trying to solve. And seeing nice tools and seeing nice software and, seeing, all of these changes that AI is introducing to the world, basically, and how technology has changed. It's so easy to say, okay, that tool would be great for my company. This tool would be great. But you have to think about, what problem are you solving with that tool? Does it really solve the problem for your team? And it's a thought process that takes place before you make any purchases, before you hire anyone. So the key thing here is to understand what you're building, why you're building it, and what foundation you're building it on. And I can't tell you how many times I see a company, the organization decides that they want to make the change, they hire someone to make the change or that's going to own the changes, whether that be an AI integration specialist, an AI adopter, change manager, whatever the case, or maybe even a technology integration specialist, right? They make the hire, they buy all these tools or a particular platform, they schedule the training, and 6 months later, nothing's changed, or the adoption is going much slower than what they anticipated. And the employees, the teams, are not too happy about the change because it was a change that they, number one, didn't ask for, number two, had no input in, and number three, don't know how it's going to help them actually improve their work or make their lives better. And no one quite knows why the investment didn't pay off because, after all, you hired this person to implement everything for you. So, why don't we have the change that we wanted? And when those kind of situations happen, it usually is because there was no assessment done. Someone decided that they wanted AI, which is very broad, by the way. They wanted AI integration. And with AI integration being so broad, you have to narrow that focus down. And the way you narrow it down is with an assessment. And usually when change doesn't happen the way the way it should, it goes back to the fact that there was never an assessment process to determine if that particular tool, if that particular software, or if that particular platform actually solved the problem. So without those things figured out, bringing someone into ambiguity and expecting results is going to be really, really tough. Actually, anytime I work with a client, the assessment is the beginning stage for everything I do because if we don't sit down and we don't talk through what the problem is, chances are you can't solve what you don't know exists or you can't solve what you don't see. So we have to see what the problem is in front of us before you can even think about what the solution is. My proprietary process for change management and AI integration is the RISE method. So essentially, everything I talk about in this episode is the R part, the reveal part. What is the problem so that we can work toward the right solution that's going to actually solve that problem? And this isn't a survey or a checklist. When we think about assessments, we are quick to think, oh, it's a survey or, it's a box I'm going to check. And that's not what this process is. The assessment that I'm referring to is a structured process to actually look at how the company or how the business is operating before you introduce technology into the picture. And it starts with a simple but an important question, and that is, what does the organization or company think the problem is? And what I always find interesting through all of my years, both instituting change within organizations and in companies, one thing I always found interesting is, as leaders, what we think is the problem, when we finish the assessment and we actually dig through everything, it sometimes doesn't align with with what's actually going on because we have our own version of the truth and the employees have theirs. And unless you're really doing a deep dive into what's going on and you know everything, how everything works within your organization, you may get different results. You may implement change and implement AI integration and bring in all the software and tools and hiring people for a problem that either doesn't exist or doesn't exist in the context that you think it does. So case in point, let's say for example, leadership, thinks, oh my God, the reports are slow and they conclude we need a better system for reporting or our onboarding process is inconsistent. Let's implement AI into our human resources department. But to figure out why reporting is slow or why onboarding is inconsistent, you have to do a deeper dive. You're just identifying what you see from a high level perspective, but what is the process? What's happening at the foundation that's impacting the reports being slow or onboarding being consistent? Because if you just bring in AI and you don't know what your processes are or what you're trying to fix, it really isn't going to work. AI is just a tool, whether you buy a software tool that's AI powered or you set up an AI powered system. Those are just tools and they have to fix a specific problem to be effective in whatever it is you're trying to do in your company or organization. And I remember I was working for this healthcare nonprofit and I was part of senior management. And one of the big tasks that I had as a senior manager for a department, I think we had about 35 people in the department, and we had about maybe 850 clients that we oversaw under that department. And I was responsible for integrating this new electronic health record system. And this system was supposed to integrate the other three systems that the department was using. And some of the problems with that whole integration, software integration process is the employees didn't want it. They didn't want this new system because it didn't solve the problems that they were actually having. The system had glitches. It never really integrated. So they found themselves like having to enter into that system and then duplicate their work into, this other system that was supposed to integrate everything and save the day. And it was a nightmare. And when it was all said and done, the agency had spent so much money on this system that actually ended up doing nothing, absolutely nothing for the organization because no one had ever assessed what the problem was that they were trying to fix. And so they went out I can't, it was, this software was very expensive, the initial purchase of it and then the monthly fees for it to not solve a thing. And it was a problem that I walked into. And as a new hire, it was a really unfair situation for me because I'm coming in, and I want to be set up for success. And I was tasked with trying to save a failing project. And that wasn't fair to me. So before you start with what software, let's talk about what the problem is. Because before you bring on that new hire, or you buy that new software, you have to figure out if something is going wrong or if there's a process you want to make efficient. You need to really dive deep into, the what that process entails. And you have to think, where is the system currently broken so that you can implement the right solution. So the first process in any assessment is to map out everything. You have the company, and then you have what happens within the company, and each section of that company has its own process. So you have to know what those processes are, how those processes overlap, so that you know how your company is functioning. So once you start diving into those processes within each section of the company, Only then can you detect, where the problems are coming from, what's wrong, what can be consolidated or condensed, what can be eliminated. Do we are we doing things that aren't serving a purpose anymore? And a lot of companies and organizations don't do enough of this. They don't assess what's happening, and they just simply have processes happening that are outdated, they're no longer needed. And with technology, it could actually be done more efficiently. But if you never map out your system and really dive deep into how each section of your company is operating, you could end up fixing something and not really having the right solution. So even as a consulting company, I have multiple components that contribute to the operation of my business. I have a marketing process, I have a sales process, I have a client management process, I have the financial systems that I have in place. So it's not about the size of the company, but it's about understanding all of the different systems that go into enabling your company to function. And that those are the systems you have to dive into and look at to see what's functioning. So if the reporting is slow, what is the reporting process? You got to map that out because it's possible there's a bottleneck that you never even knew existed. And you have to look at the systems deeply. You have to talk to the people responsible for operating every day in those systems, and that's how you get the solid feedback. So, mapping out your systems is the first step in your assessment process. Another big factor is when you think about AI integration, what is the team's capacity for that? How open are they to using new technology? Are they using technology in their day-to-day life, or does using technology scare them and to the point where they don't want to touch it? Because if you ignore how your team feels and you feel like they just are going to have to, live with the change or, simply fall in line, that usually doesn't work well. Because when you're relying on that team to produce the work and you give them this new technology and you're really not training them, and training isn't one size fits all. You have some that you'll train and they may adapt and get it right away. But you have others who may need more coaching and mentoring to understand the technology and to feel comfortable with it. A lot of times we have training and then everybody gets the same training and it's like good luck. But you really have to take the time to see where people are and to assess the comfort level people have with technology. Another part of the assessment phase is what kind of equipment do you have? Is your equipment up to standard to actually power, AI systems? Or do you need to update your equipment? Because the last thing you want to do is for your team to be in the middle of projects and things are buffering or the systems are slow, or maybe your internal systems aren't supporting the use of AI. So that's something you want to assess as well. Another thing I like to look at is what kind of change have you tried to implement in the past, and what was the team's reaction to it? What were the specific issues experienced that made that change, successful or unsuccessful? So those things are important because now you're asking them to change something else. And if the other change didn't go well, you have to know what those issues were so that you can factor that into your overall implementation plan. And if things went well, you want to see what was done for things to go well. Why did that transition go well? What was it about it? Was it related to technology? Was it related, to something else? Or was there another aspect to it that made it go well? So you incorporate all of that into your new plan so that when you integrate your technology this time, you increase the likelihood of success. And it's important to understand when you're talking about like your team's feelings about technology, this isn't what they know, like their digital literacy level. This is what they really and truly feel and what they fear about AI integration. A lot of people fear that AI is going to replace them. So now you're asking them to integrate AI without addressing those feelings. They may not adopt the technology simply because, people don't want to be replaced. They don't want to lose their jobs. And so you have to factor those things in as well because it's not a black and white about whether they can use the technology. Maybe they can use it just fine. They're just concerned about their jobs and what your plans are as a leadership for this new technology. So all of that has to be factored in to your assessment because it has to be a part of your plan for integrating AI technology or any technology into your operations. The other thing you want to think about when you're conducting the assessment is whether this change is actually going to make the lives of your team better. If it's just something for leadership, that may produce some resistance, to the change. And, back in my career, I worked with a governmental entity. Specifically, it was a probation department. I was tasked with changing the urinalysis collection and testing system. And there were 350 or so odd people that this, maybe even more, maybe 400 when you add in the administrative staff. But there were 400 people that for many years had relied on this system. They loved the way the system worked. They didn't think the system was broken. And, they were very resistant. It had nothing to do with them not understanding the change or my boss sharing why the change needed to happen. They didn't like the change. They were accustomed to the way they had been doing it, and it didn't matter that the way they had been doing it wasn't the best process. When you have that many people that you're trying to institute change and everyone has their same attitudes, and worse, they're feeding off of, the negative energy around the change, those are the biggest challenges. And it wasn't so much about like drilling in on the procedural stuff. That was pretty simple. It was the attitudes. And that is the biggest part to any change. And this was a change that didn't really threaten anyone's job, but yet there was still resistance. I mean, how I was able to navigate that and they eventually adopted the new system was through a lot of individual coaching and really serving as a support and also as a sounding board for what they felt about the change and not really dismissing, their feelings and emotions around, the change or, what we were trying to achieve. You're going to have to figure out how you're going to do the same thing with your team, especially when, you're talking about AI. You have a lot of people that hate it. They absolutely hate AI because they fear where AI is going. They're seeing the potential for bad things to happen with AI so much that they don't know what good will come out of it. And so they're bringing those attitudes into your company. And to hear you talk about AI integration, and they have these deep down and deep rooted feelings about how they feel about AI, you can't ignore that. And so you have to factor in those feelings into whatever plan you implement for the AI integration. So the end result of an assessment is not a software tool necessarily. And when you think about AI integration, because like I mentioned before, AI is very broad, you have to think about what system are you actually integrating? How are you integrating AI? It's not just this tool or that tool. How are you creating a system? And another step when you're thinking about assessment is you have to talk to the employees. You have a perception of what the problem is as a leader, but what are your employees saying? Because when you think about your day-to-day processes and really what that looks like mapped out, your teams really know what they do on a day to day more so than you do. And that may be a hard pill to swallow, but it's the truth because they're doing those processes day in and day out, and they know what the issues are, and they have a better idea about where the glitches are, so that you can fix those first before you start integrating anything or bringing in anyone who may not know that those problems are existing, or that those problems are actually the source for why their integration efforts aren't working. So the best thing that comes out of having a deep dive assessment before you buy any software and before you integrate anything is you get like a report of what's actually happening in your company. And you can use that report to make sure that whatever solution you install is the right solution for the problem that your company or any department in your company is experiencing. So now you can decide, okay, how will I measure whether my integration efforts are working? Because now I know what's happening, not a false sense of what's happening in each department or different parts that feed into the operation of your company, but something that's tangible, you see in results, kind of like that baseline data for where your company is before the AI integration. And then you can measure whether or not you're getting results. And you have a tool that actually guides your process rather than flying in the blind and guessing what's going to work to solve a problem that may or may not be the real issue for why something isn't functioning in your company. So, if your company is considering any integration of any kind, whether you're looking to bring in AI or setting up a new platform, the assessment process is where you start. You have to reveal what the issues are, what the problems are, what the source of the problems are. That way, you have baseline data for what's happening, and you can make sure it aligns with what your perception of the problem is as the leader. And you have a realistic measurement of whether your integration efforts are working. So things do not start with the selection of the tool or the technology. I can't tell you how many times I've seen leaders so committed to a particular tool that the employees didn't adopt or your team didn't adopt the first time you tried to integrate it, but then they never really go back and talk to the team about why that tool didn't work. And they also don't go back and try and assess what the issues are and what is the real problem they're trying to solve to make the second go around better. So everything starts with the assessment. So today we talked about the first part of my RISE method, which is reveal the, what the problems are, the bottlenecks and all of that. In the next episode, I'm going to get into the I part of RISE, which is the identify the fix. Because now that you know the problem, now you get to look at the best solution to fix that problem, as opposed to guessing. That tool sounds good, and it may not be a tool, but it may be a system that you actually need, to implement where you have different integrations and different types of AI powering your company. And when you think about systems, it's not just one tool, it's a process, revamping your process and understanding how your company works so you can integrate the right systems into your company, the right AI powered systems or the right technology or the right software. And that's really how you get effective results that, not just your teams are excited to use, but that they'll use long term. So, with that said, I want to encourage you to do an assessment. You don't have to be integrating anything right now, but there's no time like the present. If you're thinking of any kind of uh, integration, change, look at what's going on. Get the pulse from your team and your leadership and sit down and see if you're on the same page about what the problem is. And then you can identify the fix, which I'll talk about in the next episode. And if you are looking for support to implement any technology changes, you can reach out to me. That way, if you want to talk through what your assessment process should look like or anything of the sort, I offer those 20-minute sessions free. You can just head over to gemstoneconsultingservices.com/schedule, or you can send me an email at info@gemstoneconsultingservices.com and request, a meeting and I'll send you over my calendar link. But And it's always a good idea to get that external eyes on your company because a lot of times when you're inside your company, you're too close to what the problem is. And it's not always a good idea for you to criticize yourself. You don't, it doesn't feel good. Maybe it's, some of the sometimes it's issues that as leaders we've overlooked. We got caught up into what we were doing and we didn't know things were happening. And so when you're really close to a situation, it's hard to be objective about what the problems actually are and how they started. So it's always good to have an external person and you don't want that new hire to be the person that does it because their goal is to work with your team to get them excited about the change and so they'll adopt whatever the change is that you want. And it's hard for them to, really do that if they don't really have anything to go off of or any systems in place to help support their work. And you want to set that person up for success. So if you'd like to learn more about how Gemstone Consulting Services can help you with your technology integration and the change management in the and managing the change around that integration, you can schedule a free 20-minute session and it's a integration readiness conversation is what I call it. And you can head over to gemstoneconsultingservices.com/schedule, or you could reach out to me at info@gemstoneconsultingservices.com and let me know you saw the episode and you want to schedule a 20-minute integration readiness conversation. So, with that said, see you in the next episode. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. Bye.